At this time, we will transition to our open session, Understanding and Interrupting Anti-Blackness and White Supremacy in Our Movement. Please turn your attention to our town hall moderator, Director of Racial Equity and Social Change, Jacqueline Miller, who will introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Lalita, and hello, everyone. My pronoun is Queen. I come from a lineage, legacy, and a tribe of queens. Valériana Chikoti-Bandua is a former refugee from the country of Angola. She is indigenous to the Ovi-Bundu tribe in the southern region of the Republic of Angola. Born in the neighboring country of Zambia, due to a bitter civil war at the age of 3, Valériana's family fled the country of Zambia and found refuge in the country of Papua New Guinea, where she was subsequently raised. In 2007, she moved to the USA. Valériana holds a bachelor's degree in management information systems, a minor in American studies, and a master's degree in global governance with a concentration in international security. She has a human rights diplomat for the country of Angola in the Human Rights Committee. She is a TEDx speaker of the talk titled Protect the Girl Child. She has served in a variety of leadership capacities, from leading a statewide anti-sexual violence coalition from 2018 to 2020, to interrupting anti-Blackness and ending sexual violence in Black, immigrant, and refugee communities for over 14 years. As the founder of Necessary Interruptions, LLC, Valériana is an abolitionist on an active quest to center radical racial equity, consulting practices for businesses, agencies, and organizations through a Black liberation-led lens and championing human rights, all while operating through an anti-oppressive lens that fosters safer spaces for Black communities to thrive, despite the constant threat of systematic racial violence. Valériana is the executive director of the Social Justice Fund, Northwest in Seattle, Washington. And also, we have with us today, Darin J. Dorsey is the principal and co-founder of Rooting Movements, a consulting firm that helps organizations ensure that the values that underlie the change they intend to make in society are reflected in how they operate internally and externally. Rooting Movements helps organizations assess their practices, policies, and culture to ensure that their values are reflected in not only the work they put out, but how they do it. Darin has learned from experience that the biggest barriers to change in our communities for the better occur when inequities happen in our organizations. And he's made it his mission to remove those barriers. Darin works in community with the amazing advocates and activists he has had the privilege to connect with over the years. He believes consultation and training work is more effective when done in collaboration with other movement workers. Please welcome Valériana and Darin.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline. I'm really glad that this is being recorded because that's the best introduction I've ever had. So I appreciate that. It's an honor to be speaking with y'all today. It's an honor to be opening up this town hall with this presentation. It's going to be probably a bit different than what most folks are used to when it comes to a virtual workshop of this kind. And that's because Valériana recently was blessed with a child and brought a beautiful, healthy baby into this world. And so is not able to be here for today because it's really important that folks get some time off when they have a child, when they're new parents. However, Valériana was kind enough to take the time to record a number of videos that are based on the content that we have for you today. So you will be hearing from both of us as we make our way through this workshop. And what we're going to be doing today is having a discussion on anti-Blackness, what it is, what it looks like, how it takes place, not just the theory, but what it looks like in practice as well. To just sort of provide a baseline introduction, again, my name is Darin James Dorsey, principal and co-founder of Rooting Movements, and I use he, him, his pronouns. I will give a brief visual description of myself for anyone who may be visually impaired. I'm a Black man, a Black cisgendered man with rose gold colored glasses, a curly afro, and what I've had referred to as a bell pepper nose. I have mahogany dark skin, and I am currently in a small room, which is called a phone booth in this co-working space that I work out of, with brick on one side and gray walls around me. I want to start today with the land acknowledgement. So if we can move to the next slide, that would be great. And we already had a fantastic land acknowledgement, so I won't spend a ton of time on this, but it is important for us to continually acknowledge the land that we're on and the indigenous peoples who have had that land taken away and exploited by colonialism. I encourage everybody to type into the chat the land that they are currently taking space on. If you do not know the land that you're currently in, I encourage folks to go to native-land.ca. And there, I believe you can type in your zip code and it will tell you what indigenous lands you're on. In addition to knowing the land that we're on, I think it's incredibly important for us to reflect on the relationship of the land that we're on. Because what colonialism does is not only take land away from indigenous people and create these violent hierarchies, but also creates this exploitative relationship with the land and often portrays that as the only way that things can be, when in fact we can be more reciprocal. In today's society, that's really difficult. We're currently on Zoom. We're currently behind computers that have elements, chips, and minerals that have been mined, often from child labor, slave labor, people who are very underpaid. So I think it's important for us to, again, not only think about our exploitative relationship with the land that we're currently on, but how has globalization made it so that we are also exploiting lands in Africa, in Asia, in countries and spaces all over the world. So with that, I just want to ground our workshop in that understanding. And I want to transition to our human rights acknowledgement. Again, you're going to hear this is a piece that Valériana often facilitates. And if we can move to the next slide, that would be great. And the way that Valériana presents this, I won't do too much here because there's a video coming up where Valériana goes in and explains this quite well. But we take a look at the letter from the Birmingham jail written by Dr. Martin Luther King. And if this is not something that you're constantly aware of and utilizing in your work, I really, really encourage you to get familiar with it, print it out, put it in your bookshelf, because it is an incredible tool when it comes to violence prevention and building just communities. So we're gonna, again, I encourage folks to look at this letter after this, put it in your bookmarks, and definitely take a look at this. And before I move to the next slide, I also want to encourage folks, as a baseline, if you have not already, to please consider accessing an article that's in the written materials that were provided by NRCDB, by Mother Jones. It's called, I believe, How the Movement to End Gender-Based Violence Fails Black Workers and Survivors. And a lot of what's contained in that article includes my and Valériana's experience at a state coalition in the United States of America, and the anti-Blackness that we experienced there. It's not the whole story, but it gives a great foundation in understanding what it's like for some folks in these organizations. So with that said, let's move to the next slide and let's hear from Valériana on this human rights acknowledgement.
In 1619, the first African kings, queens, poets, writers, dancers, thought leaders were forcibly taken from the continent of Africa and brought to the Americas and to other parts of the world. To be able to do these presentations, workshops, and sessions and not have a human rights acknowledgement would literally be a disservice to Black folks everywhere. And I just want to name in this moment that a human rights acknowledgement is not a performative act. A human rights acknowledgement is centering the fact that for us to even think about collective liberation, it means that we need to center Black liberation. Because studies show, history shows, and our current times also speak to the fact that if we are hoping and praying, if we are moving towards a trajectory where we can interrupt oppression, it also means we must look at those who have experienced some of the highest levels of oppression throughout history. In naming this for today's human rights acknowledgement, I plan to read, or I am going to read, an excerpt. And this excerpt is from Dr. King, because in 1963, he was sent to prison, or he was in prison in Birmingham, Alabama, for protesting, for speaking out, for being the activist, the thought leader that he was. And this excerpt really speaks to how oftentimes there is an ideology, there is a belief system associated to how specifically Black folks need to show up in spaces, how it is okay for them to show up in ways in which most people would deem as being convenient. But Dr. King, as many folks do now fully realize, he was an agitator. He was a co-conspirator. And he spoke to the fact that this is not about convenient times. So as I read this, my hope and my desire is that in this moment, each and every one of you will think critically and deeply that if we are thinking, talking, or speaking about collective liberation, it starts with us also acknowledging Black liberation. And this excerpt reads, I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in the stride towards freedom is not the white citizen counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically feels that he can set the timetable for another man's freedom who lives by the myth of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is more bewildering than outright rejection. In this moment, I implore each and every one of you to be thinking critically and deeply about how oftentimes we hear Black folks speak out loudly, boldly, audaciously about their lived experiences. And then there are those who constantly will ask them or tell them to wait for a more convenient time. My question in this moment is, when will that time be? Because I don't know about you, but I do know that this civil rights chapter is asking more of us. In 1619.
All right. I'm so glad that folks here get the opportunity to experience Valériana's brilliance. And I encourage folks to think about, well, where have they seen equivalencies or parallels to the white moderate that Dr. King talks about in our programs, in our movement? Folks telling us, hey, we're going a little too fast here. Or, we have to really think about our relationships to these people, and maybe slow down on doing the right thing, slow down on putting the community first. So really encourage folks to think critically about that. There will be a couple places where we'll be asking for folks' feedback and experiences as we make it through this workshop. But I must admit that having over 100 people is a barrier for participation. So what I will ask is that as we make our way through this workshop, as things resonate with you, as you react to things, go to the bottom of your Zoom window and hit that reactions button. There's, I think, hundreds of reactions. You can snap, you can clap, you can thumbs up, you can smile, whatever you need to do. But I hope that's an opportunity for us to interact a little bit more, despite this format that we're in. So moving on, what we're going to do is introduce ourselves. And we do this for a very specific reason, which is that oftentimes when we show up to do workshops, when we show up in these professional spaces to do our jobs, we leave a part of ourselves behind. And our goal, when we do this work, when myself and Valériana do this work, is to bring our full selves into the room, because that in itself interrupts anti-Blackness. Because often the piece of ourselves that our organizations, that professionalism, that white supremacy, that patriarchy wants us to leave at home is our Black selves, is that part of ourselves that comes from that experience. And so as a part of our intention to bring our full selves, I'm going to introduce myself not only as my professional qualifications describe me, but also where I come from. On the screen, you'll see a number of pictures of myself and my family. And what I like to think is that every single person that you see in this pictures is someone that you're interacting with today through me. Folks who have influenced me and who have made me the person that I am today. On the bottom right is my grandmother, Dorothy Ward. I believe around 84 years old. I won't lie, I kind of lose track sometimes. And next to her on the left is my grandfather, who was in the Navy, and was also a counselor in a prison. Helped a number of Black folks who have been wrongfully imprisoned, who had been incarcerated, and supported them in understanding that they were more than an incarcerated person, and that there was more out there for them. Above my grandmother is my father tying my tie on my wedding day. Above that is myself this past Easter with my child, who at the time was about 15 months old. So he's now almost 2 years. He's about 3 months away from turning 2 years old. To the left of that is myself and my wife on our wedding day. My family is definitely a family of matriarchs. And so to the left of myself and my wife are my mother on the far left of that picture, and her sisters, her cousins, and the folks who really held it down in our family. Below that is Annetta Chin. And I always like to read a selection that my sister wrote. My sister's name is Danielle Dorsey. She's a journalist, and she's the LA editor for Thrillist magazine, writes about a lot of Black history and Black attractions in the Los Angeles area. And she wrote this piece about our great grandmother who passed away about 10 years ago. And because she's a journalist, I won't try to replicate her. I won't try to, do my own thing. I'm just going to read what she wrote. Annetta Chin, again, she's in this black and white picture on the bottom left. Born in Mississippi in 1918, she lived through Jim Crow, the Civil Rights Movement, and even got to see America elect its first Black president before she passed on. Known as Medea by myself and the dozens of children she helped raise, she was my great-grandmother. She was an Aquarius, outspoken, unapologetic, and had a fashion sense that in another time would have surely led to a career as a designer. I found out after she passed that during the 1950s and 60s, she would house civil rights legends such as Martin Luther King Jr. and Senator John Lewis, making sure they were well fed and that their children were cared for when their activism took them to Jackson, Mississippi. According to family lore, Medgar Evers' children still smile at the mention of her name. Working with the NAACP, she organized in secret to help Black folks register to vote in a time and place where doing so could get you lynched. My grandmother, who moved west as part of the Great Migration, didn't find out about her mother's activism for many years because her mother was afraid of the repercussions she might face if her letters were intercepted. I uplift the legacy of Annetta Chin, an ancestor who continues to lead me and provide guidance on my path, an unsung hero of the civil rights movement who never sought recognition, only equality. I am me because of you. So I like to share that because I try to bring Annetta Chin into this room, and I want to recognize the legacy of work to interrupt oppression, to interrupt violence that not only exists within me, but exists within this room. This was something that I didn't even know about until a few years ago. So there are a lot of untold legacies that also exist in this room. With that, let's move on to the next slide where we'll see some photos of Valériana's family. And then we'll move on to the next slide and hear a little bit about Valériana's experience, upbringing, and background.
Where it all began. Hey, folks. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you in person, but I do want to share a little bit about my background. As Darin and I constantly work as co-conspirators, co-facilitators in so many different types of formats, I just want to use this opportunity right now to acknowledge that oftentimes when people see me, they just see me, but I see my ancestors. I see the people that came before my time. For those who do not know me, let me introduce myself. My name is Valériana Chikoti-Bandua, or Valériana Chikoti-Bandua. My pronouns are she and her. I am the founder of Necessary Interruptions, a racial equity consulting firm. And I am the co-founder of the Baobab Abolitionist Coalition. And I currently wear another hat, which is I am the executive director at the Social Justice Fund in Seattle. And I work with a bunch of radical co-conspirators. But before any of these things came into fruition, my story does not start here in the Pacific Northwest. My story starts on the other side of the world. I was born into this world as a refugee. Unbeknownst to me at the time when I was born during a time of war and conflict. And my story, again, doesn't actually just start with me. I'll say it goes further back than my parents, but I'll start with my parents. At the time in which my parents were born, they both happened to be born actually in the country of Angola, in the central part of the continent of Africa, where I originally come from. I am from the Ovimbundu people group. It is a tribe that is found in the southern part of Angola. We're the largest tribe. And so in that period of time when my parents were born, and I'll start with my father's side of the family, my father's parents, who are my grandparents, were very much outspoken about the regime in which they were existing in. And that regime really speaks to the Portuguese who were colonizers in the continent of Africa, but more specifically in the country of Mozambique, Sao Tome, and also Angola. And interestingly enough, when you look at colonization in the continent of Africa, many of the colonialists either colonized parts of Africa for 20 years to maybe even 50 years. But our story in Angola is very unique. We were colonized for 500 years. Essentially, that's the period of enslavement, as many folks would even describe, because there are aspects to even slavery that to date we don't even know. And yeah, that's another story for another day. But in that period of time, which was very similar to the Jim Crow era, Black folks were not afforded the same rights as white folks. And my grandparents on my father's side were outspoken about that. The same with my grandparents on my mother's side. As a result of that, they were put on a hit list, and specifically on a list that they needed to be monitored. There was a lot of surveillance, and they had to actually essentially work hard to have their own escape or plan an escape to leave their own homeland because it was not deemed as being safe. My mother's side of the family, as my mom often recalls it, when she was around 5 years old, she was woken up in the middle of the night, and her parents essentially told her, hey, we're going on a trip, kind of pack lightly. And that would be the last time her and her parents and her siblings would be in their home. They hopped on a train and they never returned. My father's side of the family, they actually fled on foot and are probably around like a 3-month journey. They started with quite a considerable amount of Angolans who were fleeing the civil war. And during that period of time, they could not travel during the day because it was not deemed as safe. So they traveled at night. By the time they reached the Zambian border for refuge, that group of 100 people had dwindled down to just their family, essentially being the only survivors. I name this because as a survivor of violence, as a survivor of many things in this lifetime, I know that I would not be where I am had I not had outspoken agitators, co-conspirators, accomplices in my bloodline. I say this because of my grandparents. None of them are actually alive to date, but the legacy that they have continues to live on, breathe on, not just through me, but through my cousins, through the generations that are coming up. And for my parents, they eventually met in Zambia, and then I eventually moved to Papua New Guinea, where I was raised. And while I have experienced a very, very diverse and very unique life, I do know that I didn't just stumble across this work because it's cool. I didn't just stumble across the things that I teach about or talk about or educate folks on. I name these things because the civil rights chapter we're in is often asking more of us. And here I am now as a resident of the Pacific Northwest. I'm now a green card holder after a 15-plus-year-long journey. And I think of the folks who came way before my time, who had dreams of us being able to live, to exist, to thrive without the threat of anti-Blackness. And for me, I know that it is hard for me to even envision a life without paying honor and respect to those who came before me. And so for my grandparents on both sides, Avo Valériana, Avo Jeremias, for my grandparents on my mother's side, Avo Catarina, Avo Mateusz, and for my father, who honestly sowed so many amazing seeds in my life, and specifically about being outspoken, specifically about championing others, and specifically about being audacious about who I am and really living this experience as a dark-skinned Black woman. I would not be here had it not been for Mr. Antonio Calandula Bandua. I name these names because all of them are now no longer in this land of the living. They are now in the ancestral world. But more so, also paying homage to my mom, who is still very much alive and does not live that far away from me. And also to my husband, Raymond Estes, who I am so happy doing life with, and just really thankful for the full circle journey that my life has taken on, because more recently when he took a DNA test, him being an African-American man living the Black experience in America and discovering and finding out more specifically that he's from the northern part of Angola, I don't believe in coincidences. So even as you've heard Darin's story and you hear my story, please know one thing, that as facilitators, when we show up in spaces and we're radical about change, about movements, about seeing things specifically around oppression being interrupted, it's because there are so many people that came before us who are tenacious about this too. Thank you.
All right. So now that we have that out of the way, I know it's a bit of a long grounding, but I think it's really important that we do ground ourselves as we talk about this issue. I'm going to briefly go over some community guidelines and just want to acknowledge that we are talking about Black culture, Black experiences, Black content, Black history, and Black liberation here. I think it's important to acknowledge that we often group marginalized people together, often marginalized racial groups together. And it might even be in this workshop that we use the BIPOC acronym, because it is useful, and it is incredibly important that we acknowledge and see solidarity between our communities. But it's also really important that we acknowledge that there are differences in how oppression impacts our communities. And so with that in mind, I just want to be specific in saying that today we are talking about anti-Blackness. Excuse me. As needed, please take breaks. Please go to the wellness room if you need it, and do what you need to do. So moving on to the next slide, we're going to get into some of the meat of today's content. And what you'll notice is that I won't spend a ton of time on these definitions. Folks often want workshops on anti-racism, on white supremacy, and they want to spend a lot of time on definitions. And I think what a lot of folks in this room might have a common experience with me in is that oftentimes when experiencing racism, when experiencing anti-Blackness, the folks that I'm experiencing that from know these definitions, they know these words, and they know this theory, but they don't necessarily know it in practice. So again, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on these definitions, but it is helpful for us to quickly go over. Anti-Blackness is the resistance, disregard, and rejection of Black people, Black culture, Black communities, and Black values in our global community. And one of the reasons why definitions can fall short is because oftentimes what we're taking is our own understanding of these words and trying to understand it in that way. So for a white person who doesn't understand anti-Blackness or doesn't have that experience, they may see the resistance, disregard, and rejection, and they might characterize that their own way based on their experiences of being white. And so it's really important to understand that even if you know this definition, even if you can recite this definition, you might not be able to see it. You might not be able to connect to that experiences of what it's like to be disregarded, to be rejected, as a Black person if you don't have that experience, if you don't have that legacy, if you don't have that history. And so with that, I just want to remind folks of the importance of believing survivors, believing people when they tell you they've experienced harm, believing Black people when they say something is anti-Black. And if you don't understand that, if you're saying, "Hey, that I'm not sure if that's anti-Black, they just had questions here," or they just went by the book or something like that, take a step back and try to put forward some humility and understand that you might not see all of what's going on. So on the next slide, we have a brief definition of white supremacy: the belief and value associated to white people being seen, viewed, or believed to be superior than others. And I think what is really, really important when it comes to understanding white supremacy, again, we're not going to really understand it just based off this definition, but one framework that I think is really helpful to understand it within is that white supremacy is the ocean. It is not individual actions or individual structures here or there, but it is very much the foundation of our society. And that is connected to colonialism, which is structurally, again, the foundation of our society. And so things that often we might not identify as racist or white supremacy often have some of these elements in them. And this is true for other systems of oppression as well. This country is also built on ableism. This country is also built on patriarchy. And these are the foundations and the entire framework of the society that we live in. And so what I often tell folks is that, you know, some folks will go to a 1 day, 2 day training. And sometimes even that is a lot. Sometimes folks go to a 2 hour, 3 hour training and expect to know how to be anti-racist. And what I tell them is, you went through 12 years of indoctrination, of learning that perhaps slavery wasn't, or perhaps the Civil War wasn't about slavery, maybe not learning about Jim Crow, not learning about Reconstruction. All of these messages that we received over the course of decades, don't expect to fully understand white supremacy and be able to resist it after a 2 hour training or a 2 day training. This is an ongoing process. So moving on to the next slide. These are some origins of anti-Blackness, of anti-Black violence, again, very much based in colonialism. And within this framework of anti-Blackness, we also have colorism, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But I will take a step back because Valériana has an incredible lens for understanding the history of anti-Blackness, given that she was not born in this country, that she has seen and built frameworks for understanding the world outside of this context. So we'll move on to the next slide and hear a little bit from Valériana on white supremacy, anti-Blackness, and the origins of anti-Black violence.
Folks often ask, what is anti-Blackness? And also, what is white supremacy? I kind of want to start from something fundamental around what these two things are and how they often seem interchangeable in conversations that we have, especially those of us who are in the movement to end violence. So specifically, let's start with anti-Blackness. Anti-Blackness can really be defined as the disregard, disdain, the resistance, the rejection of Black people, Black ideas, Black culture, Black communities, Black values, not just in these United States of America, but within our entire global community. And the ways in which anti-Blackness often work, or the ways in which we often can see it for those who obviously living the Black experience, is often in a structural way where it's very systemic. And it targets specifically Black folks. It targets Black folks through colorism, pitting Black people against folks of other identities. And anti-Blackness often manifests in white adjacent spaces, spaces that adorn, praise, and really center whiteness. And so the ways in which anti-Blackness show up are ways that are hierarchical. And it oftentimes puts those who are darker skinned at the back of the line. It oftentimes creates a gaslighting scenario or situation where a darker skinned person will have a lived experience where they're not being believed, they're not being championed at the same way that somebody else who may identify as being indigenous, brown, or as a person of color. Anti-Blackness often thrives in silence. I'll say that again. Anti-Blackness often thrives in silence and complicity. And because of there's oftentimes with white supremacy an obsession with the written word, and that quote unquote professionalism, anything that is not deemed as looking, sounding, behaving, or being like it fits specifically with white professionalism, and is visibly associated with Blackness, oftentimes is either erased, put behind the back of the line, mocked at, or that person may be having an experience where they're being gaslit. So I just want to name that in the ways in which it shows, because it doesn't necessarily show up in one specific way. And it's important to note that the way in which white supremacy often shows up is it's the belief, the value, the ideology that is associated with thinking that white folks are more superior than others. That if a white person has said this, then their account needs to be believed over everybody else. And I name this because a way in which that often shows up is when a Black person has experienced anti-Black harm and they are saying it, and there are folks who will say that, well, that is their opinion. This is the opinion of everybody else. Oftentimes the opinion of everyone else will still be summed up to be believing that particular white person, or that person who has proximity to whiteness. And the thing about white supremacy is, I know folks often think of it as like the KKK, folks who are hiding behind a hood or hoodies. And I'm talking about obviously what we've seen probably in movies or historically in images of the white sheet that's like this big hood, and you only see that person's eyes. Well, I just want to name that white supremacy oftentimes is actually way more visible than it is even hidden, because this idea of what white supremacy often does is it comes to undermine, it comes to make specifically those who are not white feel as though that they do not have a place in whether it is decision-making processes, their own autonomy, their agency. And it makes it very difficult for them to even exist in professional spaces, because most of these professional spaces that I speak of adhere to whiteness. White supremacy does not show up in microaggressions. I would say in macroaggressions, because when we say microaggressions, oftentimes we're diluting the fact that a type of aggression has taken place and harmed somebody. It's actually a macroaggression because it lives and breathes within your body, and you who may be the recipient of it has to absorb that, has to maneuver that, has to find a way or an outlet for you to actually even seek wellness as a result of that, or even healing. White supremacy will show up in a way where white fragility is being centered, meaning when somebody has participated in something that is white supremacist, instead of owning up to it, being accountable, seeking ways in which to even center reparations, there's a default to adhere to, well, that white person is angry, now more angry because you call them racist versus the racism that they're actually doing. And last but not least, white supremacy seeks to dominate. It does not seek to uplift, center concerns of those who have lived experiences that are specifically different or differing from the white experience in these United States of America. It's also important to note that white supremacy didn't just start like recently. White supremacy didn't just start when George Floyd was executed. White supremacy has an origin that dates far back, and that speaks to a period of time of, I would even say, colonialism. And when we think of colonialism, we can actually name or date it right back to where the origins of anti-Blackness took shape, when there was a period of time in the 1400s when white European powers specifically had a meeting. And in this particular meeting, they called it the Scramble for Africa, where folks from Portugal, from Spain, from France, from Belgium, from Germany, from Italy, from Holland, or those who were, Netherlands, essentially found spaces or countries in the continent of Africa that they were all divvying up amongst each other. Can you imagine existing in your own home and all of a sudden folks show up one day who are not even from your community, and they're like, oh yeah, we've already made a decision about what this land is going to be used for, and they annihilate you, your loved ones, and you essentially have to even flee your own land. Or I should even say, you'd be lucky if you even got the chance to flee. In many respects, that's what colonialism has done to this world. And I just want to name that those origins to this date are still being felt. And it's important to note that in naming or really identifying this, I'm speaking also to the fact that we have to also pay acknowledgement to the really first victims of one of the largest forms of human trafficking, which is slavery. And in that period of time, it wasn't just the enslavement of Black bodies. It was also the uprooting of land, resources, languages, cultures, names, because there are many folks to date that cannot even trace their family origins right back because of the erasure of that white supremacy kept centering. And it's important to note that instances of colorism, anti-Black violence, all took place during that period of time.
Right. So we want to briefly bring up this power and control wheel, which I think a lot of folks are probably pretty familiar with because it's often used in understanding gender-based violence. And the reason why we want to bring this up is because we understand this framework. We utilize this framework. It's in our volunteer trainings. It's sometimes in staff orientation or various processes like that. And what we can do to better understand how anti-Blackness and white supremacy works is that we can take this framework and see how it applies to other types of violence. So in the case of gender-based violence, we see using intimidation is on here as a way that that gender-based violence happens and people are controlled. This same framework can be applied to understanding white supremacy. The fact that I feel intimidated driving home, that I can be pulled over and killed, and I have no confidence that any sort of justice or accountability will happen, is intimidation. Using children. So we have a society where Black and brown children are more likely to be taken away from their families, are more likely to be criminalized, and experience a lot of other harms. And this is often to control Black families and Black people. We can see, again, how a lot of these things take place broadly against Black communities. So I'm just really encouraging folks to make these connections between how we understand violence and how violence happens to Black people. Because for a long part of my career and my work in this movement, I've noticed that people have been unable to make these connections and have very much understood how to respond when, for example, sexism happens in a workplace. But if you frame that exact same situation with a Black person, then oftentimes the response is not the same. So I just want to acknowledge that, again, we have these understandings. We just often don't know how to apply them when it comes to this context. So I want to be a little bit mindful of time and move forward actually a couple of slides. So let's move past the next slide and then past the slide after that. And you all, I believe, will have, you'll have access to all the slides and recordings. So I encourage you all to please go back and please listen to this video that we're having to skip in order to cover some of the pieces that we have at the end of this workshop. It's incredibly important for us to recognize that our movement has been whitewashed in a lot of ways. I came into this work and I was told about the 70s and how the organization that I started out with started around somebody's kitchen table in San Luis Obispo, California, I was introduced to second wave feminism and some of the figures and leaders that were involved in that. But what I was not always presented with was the full history of the movement to end sexual and domestic violence in the United States of America. On the bottom of this slide, you'll see Celia, a slave. Celia was an enslaved person who was repeatedly brutalized, assaulted, sexually assaulted by her slave owner. And this happened over the course of many, many years. Eventually, Celia defended herself. Eventually, Celia killed that slave owner to keep herself safe. And so there was a court case, and what may be one of the first court cases in response to sexual violence occurred, and Celia was unfortunately found guilty of murder because of the context that the context of racism that existed at the time. But I think it's important to recognize Celia's place in history as someone who resisted rape and created that possibility for us. At the bottom of this page is also an illustration of the Memphis riots, which happened in the 1860s, where within Memphis, there were free Black people who were attacked by masses of white people who murdered, raped, and brutalized this community. A number of the Black women who were assaulted ended up testifying in front of the United States Senate and talking about this experience. And so I encourage folks to think about, when have we seen that recently? When have we seen folks show up to the US Senate and talk about their experiences of experiencing violence and sexual violence as a form of resistance, as a form of accountability, and ensure that we are making these connections to what's happening today and the fact that these women at the Memphis riots who experienced this harm made it possible for that to happen, made the work that we're doing today, that we do in our programs, possible. So let's move on to the next slide. This is the Anti-Blackness pyramid. Valériana built this and created this when she recognized that there wasn't very much of a framework to understand how anti-Blackness happened and what this process looked like. So the way that it works, these things don't necessarily always happen in order, but what we see is sort of an escalating occurrence of violence, where we start at dehumanization, disbelief, gaslighting, we move into colorism, we move into exclusion, and we move into public lynching, and we move into death. And I think the piece that I want to focus on when it comes to is public lynching, and then we'll hear from Valériana, who again created this framework, and she'll talk a little bit about this. But I think it's really important for me to be specific in talking about public lynching, because I think a lot of folks might look at that and say, oh, wow, like you're comparing some of these occurrences that happen in our programs and our organizations to lynching. That's quite a leap. But the fact of the matter is that a lynching was the hanging of Black people without any sort of judicial process, without any sort of fair process to say, hey, I didn't do that thing, or any input from that person. And oftentimes this happens in our workplaces. I have seen so many Black people in our organizations who are put in a situation where they don't get the option of telling their side of the story. What you'll find if you read that Mother Jones article that has been shared that highlights some of myself and Valériana's experiences is that when myself and Valériana had grievances about racism, they were not taken seriously. There was not a process to figure out what happened there. When Valériana was falsely accused in retaliation for those grievances, they created a whole investigation, shut down the entire office, and then took action to wrongfully terminate Valériana without even sharing the conclusions of that investigation. So again, there was no fair process to say, hey, we investigated this and here are the results and here's why we're doing this. And in fact, you'll see that in the Mother Jones article, they talk about the reasoning that was given to Valériana had nothing to do with the complaint, the grievance against her. But again, they didn't say that. But they used this situation to publicly lynch Valériana, to impact her reputation. Rumors were spread about her. People spread the rumor that she did what she was accused of, even though she did not, and that was never found by an investigation. And so there are parallels here when it comes to this extrajudicial hanging and the fact that within our programs, oftentimes, if a white person, specifically a white person in leadership, decides to, they can engage in violence towards Black people without any sort of process, without any sort of fairness. So let's move on to the next slide and hear Valériana's insight on this.
In 2019, when I worked at the Washington Coalition of Sexual Assault Programs at the time, I was transitioning from being interim executive director to becoming an executive director. One of the things that I was navigating, and Darin J. Dorsey was actually navigating, was a lot of anti-Black harm. I know many of you have read the Mother Jones article, and I obviously, due to time, can't get into all the specifics. But as a result of the anti-Black harm that we were experiencing, I actually created the oppression pyramid, or also known as the Anti-Blackness pyramid. The Anti-Blackness pyramid really speaks to the escalation that often takes place when anti-Black oppression is not interrupted. It starts with dehumanization, that is typically at the bottom of the pyramid. And that really speaks to this ideology or this thinking across the board that exists when white supremacy is the currency or the norm, that Black folks are not fully considered as being fully human. Wasn't that long ago when Black people in this country were considered 3/5 of a human being. And that sentiment oftentimes shows up in a way where when a Black person is in an institution, in an organization, in a community, they're alienated. There's violent behavior associated to any interaction that you need to have with a Black person, meaning they need to be gaslit, that if they are speaking or doing anything, if it's not white, it's not considered right. So that's that foundation. And the next tier that often takes place is disbelief and skepticism. And that really speaks to the gaslighting, the micromanaging, the policing, and oftentimes over-evaluation, meaning if a Black person has complained or shared grievances about a lived experience they're having, and if the default is white supremacy, oftentimes the disbelief and skepticism comes like second nature. There is language that says, oh, that's their version of events and these are ours. Always presuming, always making a case that that Black person should not be believed, that Black person, oh, they're always complaining about something. That really speaks to, again, that disbelief and skepticism. The next tier that often takes place right after that, and it can happen in several different orders, but I will say that typically in a case where anti-Blackness is showing itself to be really true, is comparison and colorism. And the ways in which that often shows up, and I urge folks, please pay attention to this, because this is a very, 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 very dangerous space to be in. Not to say that dehumanization and disbelief and skepticism aren't dangerous things, but this here, I often struggle deeply as a dark-skinned woman having this lived experience as a Black person in spaces that continuously adhere to white adjacent or folks who are deemed as being lighter skinned, who are being praised, who are being adored over those who are darker skinned. What that often does is it sponsors a climate where there will be maybe brown folks or indigenous folks being pitted against Black people. This space, this phase, this era, this move is very dangerous, because what it does is it causes discord, it causes tensions, and it oftentimes will create those who are lighter skinned to view the darker skinned people as being those who complain too much, those who are part of the problem. That's how it's deemed. I named this because in the period of enslavement, we saw how we have seen historically how that's taken place, where darker skinned people were expected to work in the fields, and those who were lighter skinned were expected to work in the house. That speaks to how colorism is just so alive and well, even now, because it's evolved in so many different ways in which we often see how someone who is lighter skinned is being believed over someone who's darker skinned. The next phase that often takes place right after that is exclusionary behavior. Exclusionary behavior speaks to the gatekeeping, this idea of fostering secrecy over transparency and fostering hostility, meaning this Black person has been dehumanized, they've experienced being disbelieved, there's a lot of skepticism about their lived experience, comparison and colorism, and now they're being excluded from meetings. They're being excluded from being able to even hear information or know information that pertains to their own livelihood. And they're now being created, or a condition is being created for them to have to, in many regards, self-deport, no longer be in a space because it's not deemed as safe. The next tier that often takes place right after that is public lynching. Public lynching is wild, because we often think of public lynching during the period of enslavement, where somebody was, or a Black person was literally strung up on a tree. But what I will say that public lynching has evolved to in this day and age is complicity, meaning everybody knows there is someone who's operated with so much white supremacy. This person shows up in this way that is so violent, but everybody knows because this person is white, because they are white adjacent, they can get away with it. So oftentimes, the folks who will call themselves allies will utilize that period in time or that moment to maybe silently agree with that Black person's lived experience, or that person who's experienced historical traumas and exploitation. But publicly, there's an abandonment, meaning they may lose their career. They may be experiencing instances where they're being blacklisted. And when I say blacklisted, I'm really speaking to the fact that they are not necessary in a space where they're being championed, to be supported, to move further on, even in their career or their lived experience, all the things. And the use of white fragility is centered during that time. And last but not least, when all of those things are not specifically being addressed or interrupted, it leads to death. Death meaning really the extinction or the erasure of a career, of a certain opportunity, the end of an employment, and oftentimes physical death. I name this because Breonna, I bet you anything, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Trayvon Martin, and the list goes on of folks who literally probably more than likely had a lived experience as Black folks when they were alive in these United States of America, where they experienced being dehumanized and everything escalated and led to their untimely deaths. I name this, folks, because we can no longer negotiate with the idea of how anti-Blackness often shows up in our movement. And if we are talking about being preventative, if we are talking about being radical, if we are talking about change, it starts with us. Meaning, even if you are a Black person, it does not mean that you cannot hold sentiments that are anti-Black also in nature. It means that if you are a brown person, an indigenous person, it does not mean that anti-Blackness cannot exist in your own community. And also, I would say, even in addition, if you are a white person and you are negotiating with speaking out against anti-Black harm that you've seen, that you have witnessed, that someone has come and told you, the mere fact that you can opt in and opt out speaks to the privilege you hold, and how you cannot say later that you are a co-conspirator or an accomplice when anti-Blackness persists and you decide to do nothing.
It's hard to follow that because Valériana has such a great understanding and way of communicating about this. But I do really want to, again, emphasize that his death part is real. Like, this is not an exaggeration in any way. Um, I have seen people pushed out of programs, lose employment for just simply speaking up, for simply being who they are as Black folks, as BIPOC folks. And loss of employment can lead to some serious consequences, especially when you're already dealing with marginalization as Black and BIPOC folks in the world. It can lead to homelessness. In addition to that, I just want, again, to be really specific and clear about how real this is. This movement has caused death. We have over-criminalized and incarcerated, particularly men of color. We have pushed Black people outside of our programs and unfairly subjected them to that. We have kicked Black survivors out of our shelters because we didn't like how loud they were. This has all happened in this movement. And so I just really want to emphasize how serious it is when we do not apply an intersectional inclusive lens on how violence happens. We end up replicating it. So let's move on to the next slide as we kind of close out here. I'm not going to read this entire quote from Angela Davis for the sake of time, but I think it's one that I encourage folks to go to these slides when they receive them, pull this out and put it somewhere where they'll see often, because Angela Davis talks about the way that as an anti-violence movement, we can be leveraged in our values and efforts to prevent violence against women. The state can assimilate our opposition to gender domination into projects of racial, which also means gender domination, because Black women and femmes and non-binary people also exist. So I want folks to bring this with them wherever they go and recognize that as movements, we are always at risk of being co-opted. And there is an intentional process to co-opt this movement, to say, hey, let's not focus on the sexual violence that's happening in incarceration and prevent that. Let's instead, let's get all these people incarcerated, and can refocus us in various ways if we are not wary of that. So moving on to the next slide, I really want to talk briefly about colorism and comparison and how this happens when it comes to BIPOC folks. And I'll read this this tweet that Dietrich Williams wrote, which says, FYI, people racialized as Black are not exempt from contributing to anti-Black racism, myself included. That's why understanding inequality as a system, white supremacy, patriarchy, etc., can help all of us. Oftentimes when anti-Blackness happens, that anti-Blackness will be maintained by leveraging a Black or BIPOC person or Black and BIPOC people to continue that or to reinforce it. I know that when the Mother Jones article was being written, and the author did about 6 months of investigative journalism, looking at documents, interviewing people, the organization that had wrongfully terminated Valériana and that we experienced racism from, they were very quick to say, hey, please talk to our employees of color. Our employees of color, our BIPOC employees who ended up staying and ended up lasting through the egregious anti-Black violence that happened, please talk to them as a way to kind of say, hey, these folks will sort of say we're doing okay here. In addition to that, they brought in a Black consultant who, one of my colleagues who stayed at the organization a little bit longer than myself and Valériana, said to this consultant, like, hey, I think what happened here is really unfair, and I don't know how to get past that. This seems really against our values as an organization. And that consultant, this Black woman who hadn't seen the results of the investigation or anything, said, hey, sometimes Black people are the problem. Sometimes Black people use this race card. So this happens so often, and I know folks who are here today have experience with potentially a Black person being brought in, a BIPOC person being brought into an organization who actually furthers the interests of those in power and prevents accountability from happening. So it's really important for us to understand that as Black people, as BIPOC folks, we have to be wary about how we are being leveraged, how we might be utilized as tools of white supremacy. So let's move on to the next slide. I won't go over this because it's a lot of text and we need to finish up here, but these are some of what we like to see from accomplices. We tend not to use the ally term because it's not as active. It doesn't imply any sort of sacrifice. Accomplice is someone who, if you're going down, they're going down with you. And so I encourage folks to again, look at these slides, download this, study this, because this is what we want to see. We don't want to see people coming to us after violence happens and saying, hey, I didn't agree with the way you were treated in that meeting. And that's it. You know, we want folks to interrupt that. We want folks to go to leadership. We want folks to write an email and say, hey, I'm putting it in this email and I'm documenting it that this person was treated unfairly. We need to actively interrupt oppression as opposed to witnessing it and not stepping up. So with that said, we'll move into the next slide. Thank you all so much for your time. I wish we had all the time in the world because there's so much to unpack here. I encourage folks to reach out. Both myself and Valériana provide racial equity consulting, organizational equity consulting, and lots of training and workshops around white supremacy, around systems of oppression, and specific to the movement to end gender-based violence. Valériana can be reached at valeriana@necessaryinterruptions.com, and I can be reached at Darin@rootingmovements.org.